Today on my channel I will make a presentation that I would hope you would like. In the past, when it came to discuss the history of the Gallas, all references started with the writings of Abba Bahiri. Often this Abba Bahiri is only known as a monk who wrote about the invasion of Ethiopia by Gallas. The title of his writing was called Zinahula Galla. Well, today you will finally find out who this Abba Bahiri is. You will also find out who killed the famous Emperor Fasiledas of Ethiopia. Enjoy the ride into Ethiopian history. Chapter 48. And the same day the king heard that Iulios had revolted against him, and sent him a message to Amata Chrestos, sister of the king on his mother's side, saying, Behold, Iulios has rebelled against you, and the whole country is in turmoil, and also I, fearing him, fled to Sharka in Atankua. And still on the third day, on the day of the resurrection, Sultan Mogassa, wife of the king of kings, sent him a message, certifying him of the revolt of Iulios, and said, He rebelled, and I fled from him, and I am in Takwesa with the children, he comes, and comes soon, king, my lord. And the king, hearing these errands from the mouths of the messengers of Queen Sultan Mogassa and the Itamata Chrestos, he rose soon. And he hurried out of the way by the way of Tankal, and encamped on his dagger. And when he was there, Iulios sent 2 writings, one for the king, and the other for the Akhet jar. That was written on them were speeches of insolence and of arrogance, and blasphemy and mouth-putting speeches over the heaven of the lordship of God's great anointed king. How soon did the king return from the region of Sarki? Iulios descended from Wagara by the way of Grand Bar, and passed to Derisa, and after that he went to the river of Reb, because Ali was in his Qesr in the council of revolt against King Sultan Sagad with the Ras Yamana Chrestos. And when Iulios came to him, the Ras Yamana Chrestos betrayed him, and fled from him, and went to Ambara, and as he marched along the path of Begameter, the Lagabaza Dengal pursued him to capture him, and with difficulty escaped, but took all his goods from his recovery, which was behind him. Let's go back to the things of Iulios, and the things of Ras Yamana Chrestos we will refer later in your log, if God make us come. After Ras Yamana Chrestos betrayed him, Iulios marched from the Reb to Darha to pass to Gojam, and fight with Ras Sila Chrestos, and having come to a land of Darha, which was called Gatba, Iulios wolted, and went to Dambia seeking to fight as king. But the king, when he heard that Iulios had gone against himself, he rose from the land of Tankal, and went to Lenga Sephra, and encamped there, and the king sent soldiers to battle with the Bladenot Geta Yonal and the Abedahun Malkaya Chrestos, Siam of the Sultan Maerd, to pursue him, and the follow wherever you go. And the king rose from Lenga Sephra, and encamped at Semra, and rising from Semra, camped at Jangwa, and there he commanded that they plunder food, and feed it to the horses, that the men might be satisfied, and strengthened to fight. And the king, rising from Jangwa, encamped at Beulah, and from Beulah encamped at Azazo, and from Azazo he went out to Macha, and the king preceded him on the high land, and Iulios came after this, and encamped in the land of Sada. And the king's soldiers, who they had gone down to the land of Sarki, gathered together, and went to one part, and those of Yonal returned, who had gone to your pursuit. And the king went out about 9 o'clock in the day to see the camp of Iulios, on a Wednesday, the 5th of Janbat, and both were seen, the king in the upper part and Iulios in the lower part. And the people who were with Iulios, seeing the king's soldiers, they were afraid, and said that they were like locusts before them, and they stationed this day every one in their camps. And not the next day, at 6 Janbat, Iulios rose from his residence to march along a path, and didn't know for where to go, because it was like the blind man without a driver. And the big Makuanan, who had taken a council of revolt with him, it was not possible for them to fulfill his wishes and help him, because their counsel was hidden in their hearts, and they dared not make it known to the people. And the king, seeing that Iulios had risen, he also rose, and formed the fighting soldiers into their ranks, and came out of his katama, and formed a chief of standing only, and another head of horses only. And Iulios awaited the coming of those who had deliberated with him the business of revolt, but to these it was not it is possible to go to him and help him. But the Gojam Nagish Keflo formed a chefra in its own right, taking many soldiers of the king, and stayed away from the king, because it seemed, that, because of the division of the soldiers, the king would be vanquished, and Iulios would vanquish. And Iulios, knowing that all those who deliberated with him on the business of revolt had betrayed him, and that Ras Sila Chrestos came, and arrived the next day with all the soldiers of Gojam, it is that the Daj Asmak Welda Havariat arrived on the same day with all the soldiers of Begameter, preferred to die for hand of the king, and fall before him. And after that, he left with the boss, and he went to where he was the king, with pride and swelling heart, and ere he came to where the king's soldiers were stationed, Iulios took hold of his soldiers, and placed them behind him, and afar off he caused his horse to run with some of his welly, and arrived where the king's soldiers were stationed, who were the Cunbet, whose chief and head was the Azai Keflo. And fled a little. This flight of his, some say it was out of fear, and others say it was a ruse. And Iulios, passing by following them, he arrived where the Matabes were, Chawa of Sagad, and these withstood, and stoned him with dross in the likeness of Goliath. And Ahara of them, whose name was Amdi, pierced him with the spear, and Iulios fell with his horse, and died, and he cut off his head. But the king, because it seemed to him that Iulios was in the middle of many bosses, he went with his own. Before King Sultan Sagad's soldiers arrived, Iulios' soldiers they fled, and turned their backs, just as the scripture says, and you have turned your back on my enemy, and I destroyed my opponent. And also the Pope Abyssinian was there, because Iulios brought him with seduction of words, and Ahara slew him, and his slayer disappeared, and by this troubled the king, and ordered him to be buried with honor in a church. And then many were slain in the battle, and the spoil, which the king's soldiers acquired from the Katama of Iulios, as well as gold, and silver, and clothes, and fine raiment, horses and mules, and all weapons, as well as breastplates, and helmets, and golden shotel, and swords, which were wrought and adorned with gold and silver, were many, and had no number. And spoil such as this was not found in any Katama, nor in the Katama of King Mahamad, and of the Asmak Yeshak with the Turks, on the occasion when King Malik Sagad overcame them, nor in the Katama of Ras Zasales, and in the Katama of the King Yaqub, when this King Sultan Sagad vanquished them, and there were no goods that were not found in the Katama of Iulios, and there was no soldier of King Sultan Sagad, who did not acquire goods. On the same day, after 9 o'clock they all gathered the soldiers of King Sultan Sagad, who had dispersed to pursue and to gather prey, and they brought Zagaram, and Dama the son of Basmo, and Labasi, and Nasrani, Kebato, Lebso, son of Roman, and Ospho, who were the weli and advisers of Iulios. And the king questioned them, just as they started the revolt business, and being sure of themselves, he ordered them to cut off their necks, and they killed us. And after that the king ordered the horses to be brought to him, which were taken, with all weapons, as well as breastplates, and helmets, and swords, and golden shotel, and they brought to him, and gathered in one place breastplates, and in another place helmets, each thing by itself, and they were like a hill, so that every one marveled, and Negaret about 25 pairs were found, and gave everything to the needy people and to all his hara, and the others goods, as well as gold, and silver, and clothes, and mules, donated with the blessing, and gave to those who took it. And there was great rejoicing in the camp of King Sultan Sagad, for cause of Iulios being killed, and because of being found a lot of prey. From this Iulios we will remember a little of the beginning of its things and the history of its origin. And he was of the people of Welica. When I was young, I didn't have no shoes for your feet, no staff for your hand, and her dress was half a shaman's, and assisted King Sultan Sagad, before he was made king. And when the king, Malik Sagad died, King Sultan Sagad fled, and went into the wilderness, and remained 10 years, even as before. We refer to the story in chapter 1 to chapter 30. In all these days of persecution and time of trial Iulios was pleasing to King Sultan Sagad, and the king did him good without measure or mode. First of all he named it Bladenok Geta of the great and the small, and after that Gal the head over the riflemen, and called him Basha, and further appointed him to the post of Sahafa Lam of Shava, and of Valasma of Ifat, and of Kas of Manza. And after King Yaqub died, and all the country of the kingdom of Ethiopia was of King Sultan Sagad, gave him Gojam in full, and appointed him Gojam Nagish as a principal, and gave him his own daughter, Avezero Malakotavat, beautiful in figure, and delightful in beauty, and holy in nature in all her nature and in all her condition, that she might be your woman. And after he was removed from the government of Gojam on account of his first revolt, the king appointed him to the post of Sahafa Lam of Damat with part of Gojam, and he did not agree with the people of Damat, and asked to the king to give thee the office of Makuan and Tiger and Bar Nagish, and the king acceded to his things, and gave him just as he told him. And Iulios, having reached the land of Tigres, he did not agree with the people of Tigra, but captured all the villages, and did so as plunder, and devastated by trapping the beasts, and killing the people, and trapping the Siam. And it shook, and coming out of Tigra, he was named for the land from Wegera, and from Salemt, and from Seaman, and from Abargale, and from Weg, and from Bora, and from Salava, from the border of the land of Dambia to Takas, the border of the land of Tegar, and to Angat. And when Iulios was in all these positions, for because of his avarice, and because of his never being satisfied, and because of his emulation against Ras Sila Krestos, rebelled against King Sultan Sagad, and died in the fight. And after Iulios died, the next day he arrived from Guaham or Ras Sila Krestos with many fighting soldiers, and he was very sorry, because it was over for he fights it, and because Iulios died by the hand of others. Men. And the king was merciful to the Weli of Iulios, and sent a proclamation to them, that they should not slay them, and that they should not take their goods again, after the end of the battle, but that the punishment of death and the taking of the goods of the day of battle was enough for them. And after Iulios died, King Sultan Sagad parked in the same place 2 days, and when the corpses of the dead stank him, the king arose from it, and encamped in Sada, and there celebrated the Sabbath. And after this he went out to Dangkaz, and there named Yonel for Begameter, and Welda Havariat for Seaman and Salamt, Vaj and Abargale, and in all as was Iulios, save only Vigara, but in Wegara he established his Hara, which were called Kokub. Chapter 49. And when he was in the land of Dangkaz, the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos sent Ras Yamana Krestos with Querina. Rather, we will remember how the Ras Yamana Krestos revolted against his brother, King Sultan Sagad, and thus how he fought with his brother, who was the eldest of all his brothers, the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos. And being the Ras Yamana Krestos in the land of Wedo, first sent to Amhara the Nagarat and the Sandak, and also after this he ordered his 2 sons to take the gate of the region. And he said to his eldest son, whose name was Eva Krestos, take the Amba, whose name is Amora Gadal. And his youngest son, whose name was Ida Krestos, said, you take the Amba, whose name is Koreb, and I will go after this with Iulios, and capture Hafa Krestos, and after that I capture him, all the counties shall be in my hand, which are Amhara and Ambasal, Welika and Mens, and Os Gala Karayu and Marawa will help me, because they are after me. And having heard these things, he told them, a volley of the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos, who had sent as a spy, that the Ras Yamana Krestos had revolted against the king, and had entered Tadbaba Mariam. And Awa Krestos then did not carry out the order of his father, who was revolting against the king, and went to his father's brother, the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos, when he was at Atransa Mariam. And he discovered to him the certainty of his father's revolt, and told the whole of the council of revolt, which had been deliberated between him and Iulios. And the Ras Yamana Krestos, rising from Tadbaba Mariam, entered Malik Amba, and the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos, having heard these things from the mouth of the Hisweli, who had sent him as a spy, and certify state of the business report by Awa Krestos, sent to Yamana Krestos brought 3 messengers, saying, why did you do that? And why did you revolt against the king, associating with Iulios? For Iulios is not a stranger, and is he not, like you, the son of the same mother as the king? Why do you destroy your kingdom and your honor, and want to give it a strange action? And the Ras Yamana Krestos answered the business, and said, but I did not revolt against the king, but when Iulios sent me a message, saying, the Hosage told me. I also joined the belief of the 2 natures, and received communion from the Father, and you also believe like me. And receives communion from the Franges. And I said to the Hosage, am I the only one who will enter into this belief? Our brothers, the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos and Ras Yamana Krestos, how can they not enter into this belief? And he said to me, beginning you, believe, and those my brothers if they believe of their own will, believe, but if they refuse, arresting them in Mesdesain, the I will bring in by force against your will. And when I heard this, I fled, and came hither to die for my faith. And the messengers returned, and told him thus to the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos, and this one again sent messengers to Ras Yamana Krestos, and said to him, do you, Lavras du Hosage, did you hear these things, or did you learn it from a message from Iulios? And he said, by message from Iulios. Greater than in Doj Asmakhafa Krestos, knowing that his word was cunning and a lie, had assembled soldiers of war, mounted on horseback, and people on foot and with rifle, whose multitude having no number, marched against him to Malik Amba, and encamped on the bank of the Qesr, and sent word to him, saying, if in you there is no thing of revolt against the king, leave the Amba so that we can meet and talk about the whole state of the business, for which I came. And they both agreed that they would meet, each one with 5 men, and swore that they would not betray each other. And the Rajamana Krestos came out of his Amba being with 5 men, and drew near a little, and the Doj Asmakhafa Krestos came with 5 men, and they both met in the midst of the land of their camps, and they sat together, and sent away all the men who came with them, and they only seated 3 men. Business men, who were witnesses among them. And the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos spoke to the Ras Yasis Crestos, and said to him, "Why did you make this business of revolt against our brother and son of our mother, the king?" And Yamana Crestos answered, and said, "I did not rebel against the king, but when Iulios sent me word, that by force they would make us enter into the faith of the Franges, and order us to receive communion from the Father's hand, so I associated with Iulios, and came hither to die in my faith." And the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos said to him, "Did they not, riding on horseback and gathering many soldiers of war, contend with the king because of faith? And if the Hosage orders you to change your faith at first, begging him, will it be convenient for you to surrender your neck and receive the crown of life in heaven in the likeness of all the martyrs? But this speech of yours is not good. What was, but now let's help our brother Sila Crestos before he dies, because Iulios went to fight with him. And the king is not present to help him, because he has gone down to make war on Sarki, the region of domain of the king of the Funge. And when I return, I will reconcile you with the king, and I will ask you for mercy, so that forgive all your guilt at first. But now let's help our brother Sila Crestos." And he assented to his business, and they both swore by the image of the crucifixion and by the inheritance of the Virgin Mary, Our Lady, who in the morning they would get up and go to Gojam to help their brother, and park the same day each in their own camps, the Ras Yamana Crestos within the Amba, and the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos on the bank of the Quesr. And the next day the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos waited for his coming until 6 o'clock in the day, and when he stopped coming, he sent a message saying, "Did we not swear yesterday that we got up in the morning, and went to help our brother Sila Crestos? Why did you leave, and delayed in coming to this time?" But the same Ras Yamana Crestos ate the bread of the oath, and drank the kalish of the covenant in one day, and despised all his brethren, rejected the business friendship, and formed the Chifra, and sent her to fight with the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos with rifles and bombards, and they often threw bullets from the muzzles of rifles and bombards, and they hit none but a tent, defeated the soldiers of the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos, and the soldiers of Ras Yamana Crestos were vanquished. And Doj Asmakhafa Crestos surrounded the same Amba, and all waters, and food, and herbs were left in his hand, it is, prevented them from eating and drinking, and all men and all the beasts, which were in the same Amba with the Ras Yamana Crestos, remained 3 days without eating or drinking. And after that came, as intercessors, the monks and the Anachorites. They asked and said to the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos, "Let them not die from the thirst for water and the lack of food, because in this Amba there are great and small, priests and monks, widows and orphans, but Yamana Crestos himself shall descend from the Amba, and go to the king, leaving the land of thy rule, as the king wishes. The will do harm and good." On these words they agreed, and the Ras Yamana Crestos descended from the Amba, and the Doj Asmakhafa Crestos bound with him his Vali Amsala Crestos with 80 men, armed with shield and rod, to be his champion until he reached the king. And after crossing the river from Bashalo, he heard that Iulios had been vanquished and had died, and from this sent word to him the Ras Sila Crestos, saying, "Behold, Iulios, your lord, in whom you trusted and trusted, is dead, and you, taking a stone on your head, go quickly, and if you are not willing, where will you go, and where will you take refuge from the king and from me?" And listening, this from the mouth of the messenger of the Ras Sila Crestos, filled with great fright, and lost hope of joy. And when he was walking through the foot of sadness, he came to land of Dankaz, where the king was, and the king, having gathered all the rulers, and the rulers on the right hand and on the left, and all the great men of the kingdom, commanded them to remember all his revolt, and all the deliberation of rebellion, which he deliberated with Iulios, to do harm to the kingdom, and there was against him the testimony of many men, that he associated with Iulios in the deed of revolt, and after this they passed sentence of death against him, not only all the manbar, but also all the principals, but the king took pity on him, and did not offend him with death, because customary mildness and human kinship prevented him from doing so this action, and for his mildness he ordered him to be banished to Gojam, and he did not repay him according to what he had done to him, because this Ras Yamana Crestos many times made him bad. First, when they made this king Sultan Sagad king in Harisma, the Ras Yamana Crestos opposed himself, and said, "I will not enter into this business, and I will not cause the kingdom of house of King Malik Sagad, because I am excommunicated." And having said this, he passed on to Amhara. Second, when therefore King Yaqub came from Begameder against King Sasanios, who was in the land of Amhara, still the same. On that occasion, when Ras Zosales came against him from Gojam, the king begged him, kissing his hands and feet, and said to him, "Come and help me, and we will fight looking for an accidented land, if they come to fight with me the Rey Yaqub o Makuanan Zosalas." But the same Rejamana Crestos did not soften towards his mother's son. he refused, and despised him, and did not acquiesce to his request. And the Lord God gave victory over Fasiledas to the king alone, his soldiers being few in number, so that turned back thousands. Third, because the same Yamana Crestos ordered and advised the Mariam, Hail, daughter of Amhara, to join King Jacob, and help him, and were not King Sultan's Weli Sagad, and promised them that after they entered, he went into King Jacob. Fourth, when a stick rose in the region of Seaman, he fled taking all his goods, his horses, and his mules, even the utensils of his house, and led them to Amhara, which makes people say of this pole, it is King Jacob. But if you didn't know that King Jacob had raised, the Yamana Crestos would not flee taking his goods to Amhara. And when the king summoned him to a meeting to make war on Gedouan and Taklui, did not come until after he made the king swear that he would not prevent it and did not capture him after the end of the war, when he wanted to bind himself with the yoke of monastic life. Fifth, when this King Sultan Sagad ordered all his Makuanan to surround Saganat's Amba from the right and on the left, front and rear, in which were the Falasha Gedouan and the impostor Warana Taklui, who called his name after the name of King Jacob, then belonged to the Yamana Crestos a gate of the gates of the Amba to fence and guard it, and he left it out of cunning to guard the same gate, and encamped where the king had not commanded, and caused the people of Falasha to escape. Gedouan and Taklui's soldiers. Sixth, what the king loved, he hated, and what the king hated he loves, and of those men, whom the king killed for their rebellions, he sent for his brothers and his sons, and made friends with them, and contracted kinship with them, giving in marriage his sisters and the daughters of his sisters with Falasha. Gedouan wanted to contract kinship, and give his daughter to his son, whose name was Wilay. But the king was displeased with him, and prevented them from doing this. Seventh, when the king ordered the volley of the Yamana Crestos made an expedition to the land of Guerrero with all the king's soldiers, refused face to face, and did not obey the king's order. Eighth, he made great agitation against the kingdom, and joined with Iulios in the deed of revolt, as we have before written his history at the beginning of this chapter. For all these evils, which Yamana Crestos perpetrated against him, the king did not resolve his heart toward the offender, but he had compassion on him, and banished him to Gojam,